There's an uncomfortable question almost nobody asks out loud when they're talking about empaths, because it feels almost like a betrayal of the whole community built around that word. But it's a question worth asking anyway, because avoiding it doesn't help anyone. What if some of the very traits empaths pride themselves on are also, quietly, the exact reasons the people who love them find it so hard to stay close? Not because empaths are bad people, not because sensitivity is a flaw, but because certain habits, born out of real pain, real hypervigilance, real overadaptation to a world that hurt them, end up pushing away the very connection empaths crave more than almost anyone else. Today we're going through 8 of those habits, honestly, without the usual online romanticizing of every empath trait as automatically beautiful and enlightened. Because real love requires real honesty, and empaths, more than most, deserve the version of this conversation that actually helps them, rather than the version that just makes them feel special while quietly leaving them alone. The first habit, they mistake absorbing someone's pain for actually helping them. This one comes from a genuinely beautiful place, a deep, instinctive compassion that can't stand to see someone suffering without doing something about it. But here's the problem, and it's a real one. Absorbing someone's pain isn't the same thing as holding space for it, and the difference matters enormously to the person on the receiving end. When an empath absorbs pain rather than witnessing it, they often become more distressed than the person actually going through the difficulty. And paradoxically, this forces the struggling person into the exhausting position of having to manage the empath's emotional reaction on top of their own. A partner comes home upset about work, and instead of receiving calm, grounded support, they find themselves comforting an empath who's now spiraling right alongside them. Over time, this teaches people close to an empath something quietly damaging. Don't bring your problems here, because it becomes my job to manage your reaction to my problem. And that's precisely the opposite of what genuine emotional safety is supposed to feel like. The second habit, they say yes when they mean no, and then quietly resent the person for asking. This is one of the most common, most painful patterns in empaths, and it comes from a lifetime of prioritizing other people's comfort over their own honest limits. An empath gets asked for a favor, a commitment, a piece of their time or energy they don't actually have to spare. And instead of saying, "I can't do that right now," which would require tolerating the other person's disappointment, they say yes, smiling, and then spend days quietly stewing in resentment that was never actually communicated to anyone. The person who asked has no idea they did anything wrong, because from their perspective, they simply asked a question and got a yes. Meanwhile, the empath is accumulating an invisible ledger of sacrifice nobody else knows exists. And eventually that resentment leaks out sideways, in passive tension, in sudden coldness, in an explosion that seems to everyone else to come from nowhere. This habit doesn't make an empath a martyr, it makes them, unintentionally, someone that people around them can never fully trust to tell the truth about their own limits, which erodes intimacy far more than an honest no ever would. The third habit, they interpret every mood shift in someone else as being about them. Because empaths are so finely attuned to emotional undercurrents, they often struggle to accept that not every shift in tone, every quiet moment, every slightly distracted response has anything to do with them at all. Someone's partner comes home stressed about something unrelated, a hard day, a personal worry, simple physical exhaustion, and instead of taking that at face value, the empath's hyper-attuned radar immediately starts scanning. Did I do something? Are they upset with me? What did I miss? This constant, anxious scanning for hidden meaning, where there often isn't any, creates a very specific kind of exhausting dynamic for the other person, who now has to reassure the empath constantly, explain their every mood in detail, just to prevent a spiral of anxious interpretation. Over time, partners and friends of empaths frequently report feeling like they can't simply have an off day without it becoming a whole conversation about what it means for the relationship, which paradoxically makes people start hiding their moods rather than sharing them honestly, the exact opposite of the closeness the empath was hoping for. The fourth habit, they give endlessly and then feel hurt when reciprocity isn't automatic. Empaths are, almost universally, extraordinary givers, attentive, generous, remembering small details, showing up in ways that genuinely make people feel cared for. But there's often an unspoken expectation buried underneath all that giving, that because I give this much, without being asked, others should intuitively match it. without me ever having to voice what I actually need. And when that reciprocity doesn't happen automatically, because most people simply aren't as naturally attuned to unspoken needs as the empath is, the empath experiences a quiet, building hurt that rarely gets communicated directly. Instead, it shows up as subtle guilt trips or a kind of wounded withdrawal, or comments laced with just enough passive resentment to be noticed, but not enough to actually open a real conversation. This creates a genuinely confusing dynamic for the people who love an empath because they can sense something is wrong, but they're never quite told what, which leaves them constantly trying to decode an unspoken standard they were never actually given the chance to meet. The fifth habit: they struggle to accept comfort even while desperately needing it. This one is deeply counterintuitive, but it shows up constantly in empaths because they're so used to being the one who provides emotional labor that receiving it feels foreign, even uncomfortable. Someone tries to comfort an empath during a hard time, and instead of simply receiving that comfort, the empath deflects, minimizes their own pain, changes the subject, or pivots the conversation back to asking about the other person's day instead. This looks, on the surface, like selflessness, but it actually creates real distance, because the people who love an empath start to feel like there's no room for them to actually give anything back, like the relationship only functions in one direction, no matter how much they try to reverse it. Over years, this can leave partners and friends feeling like they're loving someone who won't actually let them in, which is a particular quiet kind of loneliness that's hard to name, because from the outside, the empath still seems present, still seems engaged, just never actually receiving anything themselves. The sixth habit: they avoid conflict so completely that problems never actually get resolved. Because empaths feel tension so intensely, and because conflict itself often produces genuine physical discomfort for them, a racing heart, a tight chest, an overwhelming urge to make the discomfort stop as quickly as possible, they frequently default to smoothing things over rather than actually working through them. A disagreement arises, and instead of staying in it long enough to reach a real resolution, the empath apologizes prematurely, changes the subject, or simply agrees to something they don't actually agree with, just to end the uncomfortable friction as quickly as possible. This might feel, in the moment, like keeping the peace. But unresolved conflict doesn't actually disappear just because it stopped being discussed. It just goes underground, resurfacing later, often in a completely unrelated argument, carrying all the weight of the issue that was never actually addressed the first time. Partners of empaths often describe a strange, recurring experience, feeling like they're constantly fighting about small things that seem to carry a disproportionate amount of old, unspoken weight without understanding why. The seventh habit: they use their sensitivity as evidence they're always right about people. Because empaths often have genuinely accurate intuition about others, they can develop an unearned confidence that every read they have is correct, every time, without needing to check it against actual evidence or communication. This becomes a problem specifically when an empath decides, based on a feeling alone, that someone is upset with them, or doesn't like them, or is being dishonest, and then acts on that conclusion as though it were confirmed fact, sometimes withdrawing from a relationship entirely based on an intuition that was never actually verified. This creates real damage in close relationships, because the person on the receiving end is essentially being judged and sentenced based on evidence they were never given the chance to see or respond to. Genuine intuition is a gift. Treating every intuition as infallible, without ever checking it against reality, turns that gift into something that quietly punishes people for feelings the empath assumed but never actually confirmed. And the eighth habit, the one that ties all the others together: they equate being needed with being loved, which makes it almost impossible for them to accept a relationship built on mutual ease rather than constant emotional labor. This is, in many ways, the root habit underneath every other one on this list. Somewhere along the way, often in childhood, often in a family system that only rewarded them for being useful, helpful, endlessly available, an empath learned that their value was tied to what they could provide for others, rather than simply who they were. This means healthy, easy, low-drama relationships can actually feel unfamiliar, even slightly suspicious, to an empath who spent their whole life equating love with effort, crisis, and constant emotional management. And this is exactly why so many deeply caring, genuinely loving empaths end up, again and again, in relationships that require enormous amounts of labor to sustain. Not because those relationships are the only ones available to them, but because a relationship that doesn't require that labor doesn't yet register internally as real love at all. And once you actually see these 8 habits laid out together, something becomes clear that the online empath community rarely wants to admit. None of this makes empaths unlovable. It makes them, like every other human being, capable of patterns that were built for survival, but that now, in adulthood, quietly get in the way of the very closeness they want more than almost anything else. And in the next part of this conversation, I want to walk you through what it actually looks like to unlearn these 8 habits. Not by becoming less sensitive, less caring, less deeply feeling, but by finally learning to let that sensitivity serve connection, instead of quietly sabotaging it. Let's talk about what it actually looks like to unlearn these 8 habits, because the goal was never to become less sensitive. Sensitivity was never the problem. The problem was always what got built on top of it, usually very early in life, usually as a survival strategy in a family or environment that only made room for a certain version of you. Unlearning this isn't about suppression, it's about redirection, taking the exact same depth of feeling and finally pointing it somewhere sustainable, instead of somewhere that quietly exhausts everyone involved, including yourself. Let's start with the first habit: absorbing pain instead of witnessing it, because the shift here is one of the most important in the entire list. The skill to build is what therapists sometimes call differentiated empathy, the ability to feel with someone without becoming them. This looks, in practice, like a very small internal pause before reacting to someone else's distress, a breath, a moment of noticing. This is their pain, not mine, before responding. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but that half-second pause is the entire mechanism that separates absorption from witnessing. Witnessing sounds like, "That sounds really hard, I'm here," delivered from a place of steadiness. Absorption sounds like matching their distress decibel for decibel, until the person in pain now has 2 people to comfort instead of one. Practicing the pause consistently over time is what finally builds the emotional container strong enough to hold someone else's storm without capsizing alongside them. The second habit, saying yes when you mean no, requires building a completely different muscle: tolerating someone else's disappointment without immediately trying to fix it. This is genuinely hard for empaths because disappointing someone feels, to their nervous system, like actual danger, even when nothing dangerous is actually happening. The practice here is deceptively simple and enormously uncomfortable at first. Say the honest no, and then do nothing to soften the aftermath except sit with your own discomfort until it passes on its own. Not over-explaining, not offering an elaborate substitute, not immediately checking in 3 times to see if they're still upset with you. Just, "I can't do that right now," followed by silence, followed by trusting that the other person is allowed to feel disappointed, and that their disappointment is not automatically your emergency to manage. The third habit, interpreting every mood as being about you, gets unlearned through a practice that sounds almost too basic, but is remarkably effective: asking out loud, instead of assuming internally. Instead of spiraling silently through possible explanations for someone's quiet mood, simply asking, "Hey, you seem a little off today, is everything okay?" And then believing the answer you're given, rather than continuing to privately audit it for hidden meaning. This single shift, trusting stated reality over imagined subtext, does more to rebuild ease in a relationship than almost anything else on this list, because it finally allows the other person to just have an ordinary bad day without it becoming an event. The fourth habit, giving endlessly and resenting unspoken non-reciprocity, requires learning one of the hardest lessons for any empath. Your needs have to be spoken, not intuited, if you want any real chance of having them met. This means actually naming what you want, clearly, even though naming it feels uncomfortably direct, even selfish, to a nervous system trained to give without asking. I've been doing a lot of the emotional heavy lifting lately, and I'd really love it if you checked in on me the way I check in on you. Is not manipulative, not needy, not too much. It's simply information the other person needs in order to actually meet you, instead of being expected to guess a standard you never told them existed. The fifth habit, struggling to accept comfort, gets unlearned through deliberate, sometimes clumsy practice. When someone offers you care, let it land out loud without immediately deflecting it back onto them. Something as small as, "Thank you," that actually really helps, followed by silence. Resisting the urge to immediately ask about their day instead starts to rebuild the capacity to receive that so many empaths lost somewhere along the way. This feels at first almost unbearably vulnerable, but it's exactly that vulnerability that finally lets the people who love an empath feel like the relationship has room for them too. The sixth habit, avoiding conflict to the point that nothing gets resolved, requires learning to tolerate the physical discomfort of friction long enough to actually reach the other side of it. This means staying in a hard conversation past the point where your body is screaming at you to smooth it over, apologize prematurely, or change the subject. It means learning that the racing heart, the tight chest, the urge to just make it stop, none of that is actual danger. It's simply an old alarm system, calibrated by years of conflict feeling unsafe, finally getting recalibrated by evidence that this specific disagreement, right now, with this specific person, is survivable all the way through to an actual resolution. The seventh habit, treating intuition as infallible fact, requires building the habit of checking your read against reality before acting on it. This looks like saying, out loud, "I got the sense you might be upset with me, is that true?" instead of quietly withdrawing based on an assumption that was never actually confirmed. Intuition is valuable as a starting point for a conversation. It becomes dangerous the moment it's treated as a finished conclusion that doesn't require any outside verification at all. And the eighth habit, equating being needed with being loved, is, in many ways, the deepest and slowest one to unlearn, because it usually reaches back into the earliest architecture of how an empath first learned they were valuable at all. This one isn't solved by a single practice or a single conversation. It requires, over time, deliberately staying present inside relationships that don't require constant labor to sustain. Noticing the unfamiliar quiet of ease, resisting the urge to manufacture a crisis just to feel useful again, and slowly, patiently, teaching your own nervous system that calm isn't a warning sign of neglect. It's simply what health actually feels like once you're no longer used to interpreting peace as a prelude to abandonment. I want to say something important before we close, because I think it matters more than any single habit on this list. None of this work is about becoming less of an empath. The depth, the perception, the compassion, the ability to sense what other people are feeling before they've said a word, none of that has to be sacrificed in order to become easier to love. In fact, the opposite is true. Every single one of these 8 shifts makes the empath's natural gifts more powerful, not less, because it finally removes the distortion that was quietly built on top of them by years of over-adaptation, fear, and unmet need. An empath who witnesses instead of absorbing becomes a genuinely stabilizing presence in someone else's storm, instead of another storm to manage. An empath who says a real no becomes someone whose yes finally means something. An empath who asks instead of assumes builds relationships based on actual understanding rather than anxious guesswork. An empath who receives becomes someone people can finally, fully give to, instead of loving someone who never lets them all the way in. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures the entire shift we've talked about today. Picture a river that spent years carving its way through soft, yielding stone. A river that never learned to hold its own banks, because the ground around it kept giving way under even gentle pressure. Every storm that came through widened it a little more, scattered it a little further, until eventually the river's water spread so thin across such a wide, shallow bed that it could barely move anything at all. It touched everything nearby. It nourished a wide, sprawling stretch of land. But it had no real depth left anywhere, no real current, no real force. Just an exhausted, shallow spread, giving a little of itself to everything it touched, and having almost nothing left over for its own actual course. Now picture that same river, given proper banks, not walls built to trap it, but banks strong enough to hold its shape, to give its water somewhere defined to move, rather than endlessly dispersing outward in every direction it possibly could. And something remarkable happens once those banks exist. The exact same water, the exact same volume, the exact same generous, giving nature, it deepens, it gains current, it becomes capable of carrying real weight, moving real distance, reaching places a shallow, undefined spread of water never could have reached on its own. That's what these 8 shifts actually are. Not a wall built to contain an empath's gift. Just banks, finally, strong enough to hold it, so that all that depth, all that feeling, all that capacity to care, finally has somewhere real to go, instead of thinning out endlessly across everyone and everything it touches until there's nothing deep left for the people who actually stayed long enough to need it most.